In the year 1532, as the great maritime republic of Venice thrived on trade and culture, the art of illumination, the painstaking craft of adorning manuscripts with gold, intricate borders, and vibrant illustrations, was fading into obscurity. The printing press, an invention that had revolutionized Europe, now threatened the livelihood of artisans like Lorenzo Valiani. Once, his workshop had been a place of wonder, where noblemen and scholars commissioned exquisite works that brought the pages of scripture and literature to life. Now, it stood nearly empty, save for Lorenzo himself, the scent of ink and parchment lingering like ghosts of a vanishing era. Lorenzo had spent his life mastering the delicate strokes of his quill, blending crushed minerals into luminous pigments, and breathing artistry into words. But the world was moving on. Wealthy patrons no longer saw value in the slow, meticulous work of the Illuminator. The press could produce books in days rather than months, and the beauty of the handcrafted tome was being replaced by the efficiency of the printed word. Lorenzo's apprentices had left, lured by the bustling print shops that promised steady wages. His reputation, once lauded in the halls of Venice's elite, was now a remnant of a forgotten past. Disillusioned and uncertain of his place in this new world, Lorenzo's fortunes took an unexpected turn one evening when an aged scholar named Pietro entered his workshop. The man's fingers, weathered by years of study, clutched a leather-bound tome. His eyes, filled with urgency, bore into Lorenzo's soul. "Master Valiani," Pietro whispered, glancing toward the shadows as if fearful of unseen ears, "I have something of great importance. A book that must not be lost to time." Curiosity overcame Lorenzo's hesitation as he took the manuscript into his hands. The cover was worn, its edges frayed with age. The pages, thick and yellowed, bore inked letters in an archaic hand, the script precise yet foreign. As he turned the pages, his breath caught. The contents were unlike anything he had ever seen, a collection of lost knowledge, ideas that had been erased from public discourse, scientific observations that defied the doctrines upheld by powerful institutions. "This book was meant to be destroyed centuries ago," Pietro murmured, his voice grave. "But knowledge is not so easily erased." The weight of history pressed upon Lorenzo's shoulders. He understood the danger immediately. Venice, though a beacon of art and trade, was also a city governed by strict authority, where the Council of Ten and the Inquisition watched for any threat to their control. To possess such a manuscript was an act of defiance, to illuminate it, ensuring its survival through beauty and art, was an act of rebellion. Days turned into weeks as Lorenzo studied the manuscript in secrecy. He pored over its words by candlelight, tracing the thoughts of ancient thinkers, philosophers, and scientists who had dared to challenge the established order. He knew that once the Church had embraced scholars, now it feared them. The book contained ideas that, if revealed, could shift the balance of knowledge and power. But whispers are swift in Venice, and soon danger loomed. One evening, a heavy knock shattered the silence of Lorenzo's workshop. 3 men entered, agents of the Council of Ten, their dark cloaks carrying the weight of authority. "We have heard," one of them said, his voice like the scrape of steel, "that you possess a book that should not exist." Lorenzo's heart pounded, but he met their gaze with the steady resolve of an artist who had spent his life perfecting patience. "I am but an illuminator," he replied. "I preserve beauty, not danger." The leader sneered. "Beauty is harmless. Ideas, however, are not. We will return. If we find what we seek, you will burn with it." As the door slammed shut behind them, Lorenzo knew he had but one choice: he had to flee. Taking only what he could carry, he slipped into the labyrinthine alleys of Venice, the manuscript hidden beneath his cloak. He sought refuge in the home of Isabella, an old friend and scholar who had once been forced to abandon her own pursuit of knowledge. It was she who led him to a clandestine circle of thinkers who worked in the shadows to preserve the wisdom that others sought to erase. "The book you carry," one of them told Lorenzo, "is more than history. It is a key to understanding what we have lost." Determined to ensure its survival, Lorenzo struck a dangerous bargain with Marco Conti, a rebellious printer unafraid to challenge authority. "You ask much of me," Marco said, eyeing the manuscript with both reverence and fear. "To print this is to risk everything." "And to do nothing?" Lorenzo countered. "To let knowledge die in the dark?" Marco hesitated only a moment before nodding. The manuscript would be copied, its truth scattered across Europe in secret. But even as Lorenzo worked by candlelight, his quill dancing across vellum, he felt the noose tightening. Someone had betrayed them. One night, the door burst open, and the council's enforcers dragged him from his workbench. Before the judges of Venice, Lorenzo stood accused of heresy and sedition. The inquisitor lifted the manuscript, his expression a mask of cold judgment. "This," he declared, "is a work of defiance. Do you deny it?" Lorenzo's voice, though weary, was unbroken. "I deny nothing. Knowledge is neither good nor evil, it is only truth. And truth, once seen, cannot be forgotten." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Some nodded in silent agreement, others scowled in condemnation. The verdict was swift: his works were to be burned, and he, spared only by unseen sympathizers, was sentenced to exile. But the seed had been planted. The manuscript had already begun to spread. Banished from Venice, Lorenzo wandered through Europe, finding sanctuary among those who still cherished the pursuit of knowledge. He continued his work, illuminating wisdom in hidden corners of the world. Years later, whispers reached him: copies of the manuscript had surfaced in clandestine libraries, its ideas debated among scholars, carried across borders by those who refused to let the light of truth be extinguished. And so, as the printing press threatened to erase his craft, Lorenzo had instead given it new purpose. What had begun as a single illuminated manuscript had become something greater, a beacon in the darkness, a defiance against oblivion. And as long as there were those who sought knowledge, the work of the Illuminator would never truly end. Chapter 1: The Fading Art. Venice, 1532. The scent of ink and aged parchment filled the air of Lorenzo Valiani's workshop, a place once revered for its masterful illuminations. Shells lined with pigments crushed from lapis lazuli, vermilion, and gold leaf stood untouched, their brilliance fading under a thin layer of dust. Stacks of unfinished manuscripts lay forgotten on a long wooden table, the delicate flourishes of ivy and mythical beasts half drawn in the margins, waiting for a hand that had lost its purpose. Lorenzo had once been among the most sought-after artisans in Venice. Noblemen, scholars, and clergy had come to him, eager to own manuscripts graced by his touch. His work had adorned the libraries of princes, its beauty held in reverence. But the world was changing. The printing press, once a marvel, had become a force of reckoning, reshaping the very essence of knowledge. Where once books were treasures, painstakingly crafted over months, they were now churned out in days, their uniform lines devoid of the soul and splendor he had spent a lifetime perfecting. His apprentices had abandoned him, drawn to the promise of stability in the print shops that now dominated the city. Patrons who had once admired his craftsmanship now turned their backs, dismissing his illuminations as antiquated relics of a dying tradition. Lorenzo was no fool. He understood progress, but he could not help but feel that something sacred was being lost in the transition. The art of illumination was more than decoration. It was an act of devotion, a merging of scholarship and artistry that imbued books with life. On this particular evening, as the light from flickering oil lamps danced upon his workshop's walls, Lorenzo sat alone at his workbench, tracing a finger along the edge of a vellum page. The half-finished manuscript before him depicted a celestial scene, a radiant sun crowned with gold leaf, its rays illuminating the earth below. It had been commissioned by a wealthy merchant, but payment had never arrived. The patron had opted instead for a printed volume from Germany, a decision that spoke volumes about the times he lived in. The sound of heavy footsteps interrupted his thoughts. The door creaked open, revealing an old man wrapped in a thick cloak, his face lined with age and worry. Pietro, a scholar whom Lorenzo had known for years, stepped inside, his keen eye scanning the workshop before settling on the Illuminator. "Master Valiani," Pietro whispered, shutting the door behind him with careful deliberation. He clutched a leather-bound tome to his chest, his hands trembling as though he carried something of immense weight, both physical and metaphorical. Lorenzo frowned, rising to meet him. "Pietro? You look troubled." The scholar took a deep breath, glancing around as if ensuring they were alone. "I have something of great importance," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A book that must not be lost to time." Lorenzo hesitated before reaching out. The tome was ancient, its binding cracked and frayed. As he ran his fingers over the cover, he felt the roughness of age, the weight of centuries pressing against his palms. He opened it carefully, his practiced hands handling the delicate pages with reverence. The text, written in an archaic hand, was dense and intricate, its meaning elusive at first glance. But as his eyes adjusted to the unfamiliar script, realization dawned upon him. These were no ordinary words. This was knowledge long thought erased, a manuscript that should not exist. Lorenzo swallowed, his pulse quickening. "Where did you find this?" Pietro exhaled sharply. "That does not matter now. What matters is that there are those who would see it destroyed. Knowledge, Lorenzo, is power. And power, when feared, is silenced." Lorenzo turned another page, his gaze falling upon diagrams, astronomical calculations, medicinal formulas, theories that defied the teachings of the Church. "This book is dangerous," he murmured. Pietro nodded gravely. "And that is why we must ensure it survives." The workshop, once filled with Lorenzo's dying art, now held something far greater than illuminated pages. It held the weight of history, the promise of knowledge, and the peril of truth. And for the first time in years, Lorenzo Valiani felt the spark of purpose reigniting within him. Chapter 2: A Hidden Treasure. Night after night, Lorenzo Valiani sat hunched over his work table, the flickering glow of candlelight casting long shadows on the walls of his workshop. The ancient manuscript lay open before him, its parchment pages rough beneath his fingertips. The ink, though faded in places, retained an elegance that spoke of the scholar's steady hand, its script winding like the delicate vines he once illuminated with gold. But it was not the artistry of the text that fascinated Lorenzo, it was the knowledge within. The word spoke of forgotten wisdom, ideas from ancient thinkers that had been deemed heretical, scientific observations that challenged long-held beliefs, and philosophical inquiries that questioned the very nature of power and faith. The text pulsed with defiance, as though each word had been written in secret, preserved against the tides of history that sought to wash it away. The more Lorenzo read, the more he felt the weight of its significance. Pietro returned one evening, his expression more grave than before. He paced as Lorenzo turned a page, his breath catching as he beheld an intricate diagram, an astrological chart unlike any he had seen before, one that defied conventional celestial maps. The planets and stars were marked with unfamiliar symbols, their position suggesting a knowledge that should have been lost to time. "Do you understand what you hold?" Pietro asked, his voice hushed but insistent. Lorenzo nodded slowly, his mind still racing to grasp the full extent of what he had uncovered. "This book, it speaks of the movements of the heavens in ways I have never encountered. It questions, no, it refutes accepted truths." Pietro leaned forward, placing a trembling hand on the open page. "This book was meant to be destroyed centuries ago," he whispered. "But knowledge is not so easily erased. There were those who defied the authorities, who risked everything to preserve these words. And now, it has found its way to you." Lorenzo exhaled deeply. The printing press had ushered in an age where books were no longer rare treasures, where ideas could spread more freely. But it had also made it easier for the powerful to control information, to dictate what knowledge was safe and what was dangerous. This manuscript, with its revelations, was something that some would rather see consigned to flames. A realization struck him then, cold and unrelenting: if he illuminated this text, if he preserved it in the meticulous artistry that had defined his life, it would endure beyond a single book. Unlike printed volumes, which could be seized and burned in great numbers, an illuminated manuscript, crafted with gold, color, and intricate detail, would be considered a work of art. It would be passed from hand to hand, hidden, treasured. It would survive. But survival came at a cost. Whispers began to spread. A shadow of unease settled over Lorenzo's workshop as he noticed strange glances from his neighbors. A merchant who had once been friendly now averted his gaze. A former patron paused too long outside his door. Someone had seen the book. Venice was a city of secrets, where whispered words could carry as much weight as a blade in the dark. And in a city governed by the watchful eyes of the Council of Ten, knowledge could be as dangerous as heresy. Lorenzo pressed his hand to the manuscript, as though to shield it from the fate that loomed ever closer. If he was to protect this treasure, he would have to act quickly. He would have to be clever. And, above all, he would have to be prepared for the danger that was already creeping toward his door. Chapter 3: Shadows of Authority. The hour was late when a heavy knock shattered the silence of Lorenzo Valiani's workshop. The flickering glow of his oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls, illuminating half-finished illuminations and scattered sheets of parchment. The sound came again, more insistent this time, reverberating through the wooden door. Lorenzo set down his quill, his heart hammering in his chest. Only those with urgent business knocked so forcefully at this hour, and urgency in Venice was rarely a sign of good fortune. He hesitated before unlatching the door. The moment it swung open, 3 figures stepped inside. Cloaked in the dark robes of authority, their presence was as unmistakable as it was unwelcome. Agents of the Council of Ten. The secretive enforcers of Venice's law, their reach extended into every shadowed corner of the city. The leader, a tall man with a hawkish nose and piercing eyes, surveyed the room with thinly veiled contempt. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and let the silence hang thick before he finally spoke. "We have heard," he said, his voice smooth yet laced with menace, "that you possess a book that should not exist." Lorenzo's pulse quickened. He fought to keep his expression neutral. "I am but an illuminator," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I preserve beauty, not danger." The leader's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "Beauty is harmless. Ideas, however, are not. There are those who would see dangerous ideas bound in ink and passed from hand to hand. You understand, of course, that we cannot allow such things to take root." One of the other men stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he scanned the cluttered workshop. He reached out and lifted a piece of parchment, one of Lorenzo's unfinished works, inspecting it as though he might find something incriminating hidden within its delicate patterns of gold and blue. Lorenzo resisted the urge to snatch it back. To show defiance was to invite suspicion. The leader stepped closer. "We will return. If we find what we seek, you will burn with it." Lorenzo bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deference, though his mind was already racing. The moment the agents turned and left, closing the door behind them, he exhaled sharply, pressing a hand against the work table to steady himself. They knew. Or at least, they suspected. And suspicion alone could be enough to seal his fate. He crossed the room swiftly, his hands moving with purpose as he gathered his tools and a small satchel of supplies. The manuscript, his dangerous treasure, lay hidden beneath a false bottom in a wooden chest, wrapped in cloth. He retrieved it, his fingers tightening around its worn leather cover. He could not allow it to be destroyed. There was no time to waste. The Council of Ten's enforcers were methodical, and when they returned, they would not come alone. He threw a heavy cloak over his shoulders, tucking the manuscript safely beneath its folds, and cast one final glance around his workshop. This place had been his life's work, filled with hours of devotion, of ink and gold, of artistry now threatened by forces far greater than himself. A pang of sorrow struck him as he stepped to the door. He did not know when, or if, he would see his workshop again. But survival, and the preservation of knowledge, meant more than sentiment. Without another moment's hesitation, he slipped into the labyrinthine streets of Venice, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Chapter 4: The Scholar's Secret. The narrow alleyways of Venice had never felt more treacherous as Lorenzo navigated their twisting paths under the cover of darkness. Each hurried step echoed against the damp stone walls, and every shadow seemed to whisper of unseen pursuers. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he did not slow. The manuscript, his precious, dangerous burden, was pressed tightly to his chest, hidden beneath the folds of his cloak. When he finally arrived at the modest house near the Rialto, he rapped on the door in a deliberate pattern, the way he had been taught long ago. The door opened just enough for a pair of sharp eyes to appraise him, and then, without a word, he was pulled inside. Isabella stood before him, candlelight casting warm flickers across her sharp features. Age had not dulled her brilliance, nor had the years softened the determination in her eyes. She was a woman of knowledge, a scholar who had once dared to study texts that others had deemed forbidden. "Lorenzo," she murmured, scanning his face for answers. "You look as though you've seen the devil himself." He exhaled, shaking off the chill that clung to his bones. "Perhaps I have. And if I have, he wears the robes of the Council of 10. She motioned for him to sit, and he did, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He placed the manuscript carefully on the table between them, unwrapping the cloth that protected it. The moment Isabella saw it, her breath caught. "The lost text," she whispered, fingers hovering above the worn leather cover. "I had heard rumors, but I never thought." Lorenzo nodded. "Pietro entrusted it to me. But now the council hunts for it. I need your help, Isabella. I cannot protect this alone." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you have come to the right place." That night, Isabella led Lorenzo to an underground chamber, hidden beneath a quiet study. There, by the glow of oil lamps, a small gathering of scholars pored over delicate scrolls and faded parchments. These were men and women who had devoted their lives to preserving knowledge that the powerful wished to erase. An elderly man, his hands ink-stained and trembling with age, reached for the manuscript with reverence. "The book you carry," he said, voice thick with awe, "is more than history. It is a key to understanding what we have lost." For weeks, Lorenzo worked in secrecy alongside them, transcribing and illuminating the text with the same precision he had once devoted to the commissions of noble patrons. But this was different. The weight of responsibility grew heavier with each passing day. This was no longer mere artistry, it was preservation, resistance, defiance. As the days bled into nights, he learned the names of his fellow conspirators, their stories woven together by the shared belief that knowledge should never be extinguished. But trust was a fragile thing. Not all who sought knowledge wished to preserve it. One evening, as he meticulously traced gold leaf onto the edges of an illuminated page, he overheard hushed voices in the corridor beyond the chamber. "The risk is too great," one man murmured. "If the council finds us, we will all hang." "And if we do nothing," another whispered harshly, "then we have already lost." Lorenzo's hand trembled slightly as he set down his quill. He had known from the moment he took the manuscript that danger would follow. But he had not expected the danger to come from within. As he listened, the flickering lamplight cast long, wavering shadows on the walls. And in that moment, Lorenzo understood their greatest enemy was not only the Council of 10, it was fear itself. Chapter 5: A Dangerous Bargain. Lorenzo Valiani stood at the threshold of Marco Conti's print shop, the manuscript wrapped tightly in cloth beneath his arm. The night air was thick with the scent of ink and damp parchment, mingling with the briny whisper of the Venetian canals. He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. This was not a place he frequented, the world of the press was one he had always regarded with wary disdain. Yet now, the very invention that had threatened his craft might be his only salvation. Marco Conti, a man known for his defiance of authority, looked up from his work, his ink-stained hands pausing over the type blocks he had been setting. His sharp eyes, shadowed by flickering lamplight, studied Lorenzo with curiosity and suspicion. "You ask much of me, Lorenzo," he said, his voice low and firm. To print this is to risk everything. Lorenzo unwrapped the manuscript with great care, revealing the delicate, illuminated pages within. And to do nothing, he countered. To let knowledge die in the dark? Marco exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thick, graying hair. He was a businessman, not an idealist, but even he understood the weight of history that rested in those pages. He lifted one carefully, scanning the words and illustrations that had already cost so much. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "I will do it," he said. "But we must be careful. The Council of 10 has spies everywhere. If they discover what we are doing, it will not be the pages that burn, but us." And so, the secret work began. Marco assigned only his most trusted apprentices to the task, working by the dim glow of lanterns well after midnight. Each page was copied with meticulous precision, the words transferred to movable type, while Lorenzo labored to recreate the illuminations by hand. He would not allow the artistry to be lost entirely, not when it had carried knowledge through the ages. But the weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air. Lorenzo knew that the council's spies lurked in every shadow, their ears tuned to whispers of dissent. And then, one evening, as he bent over his work, the feeling of unease solidified into certainty. A muffled conversation at the back of the print shop. A hurried departure. Averted eyes from one of Marco's apprentices. Someone had spoken. The realization struck just as the heavy knock echoed through the wooden doors. Lorenzo's heart pounded. Marco shot him a glance, one filled with urgency and warning. The door burst open, and the dark-cloaked agents of the Council of 10 poured in. This time, there would be no veiled threats, no second warnings. This time, they had come to take him away. Chapter 6: The Trial of Truth. The vaulted stone chamber of the Venetian court was cold, the air thick with tension. Lorenzo stood at the center, his once pristine robes now disheveled from days of confinement. His hands trembled, but he clenched them into fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain composed. The sound of murmurs filled the air as a sea of faces, some familiar, some unknown, stared at him with a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and fear. The room was dim, lit by the flickering flames of wall sconces that cast long shadows across the faces of the judges. At the far end of the room, elevated upon a platform, sat the Council of 10, the most powerful body in Venice, whose reach extended into every aspect of life in the Republic. Their faces were impassive, but their eyes glinted with quiet judgment. Beneath their gazes, Lorenzo felt like a mere insect under a magnifying glass, every part of him dissected and weighed. Above them, the lead inquisitor, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was whispered about in the corridors, stood with the manuscript in his hands. It had been the cause of all this turmoil, the object that had brought him to this place. The manuscript that had nearly cost him his life. And the manuscript that, despite everything, had already begun to fulfill its purpose. This, the inquisitor's voice rang out, cutting through the murmur of the crowd, is a work of defiance. He held the book aloft, its worn leather cover barely clinging to the pages within. The faint traces of gold and ink that Lorenzo had so carefully illuminated now seemed to mock him in the harsh light of the courtroom. This, the inquisitor repeated, is a challenge to the very foundations of our society, a defilement of our most sacred doctrines. Do you deny it, Master Valiani? Lorenzo's heart pounded against his chest, each beat a drum of fear, but his voice remained steady, unwavering. "I deny nothing," he said, his words clear and resolute. "Knowledge is neither good nor evil, it is only truth. And truth, once seen, cannot be forgotten." The room fell into a stunned silence. The words seemed to hang in the air, their weight heavier than any accusation. Some of the judges looked at him with surprise, as if his words had struck a chord within them. A few nodded, though they did so cautiously, as though afraid to show their true feelings. Others scowled, their lips curling into sneers, unwilling to entertain such blasphemous thoughts. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "You speak of truth, but truth is a weapon. A dangerous weapon. And you, Master Valiani, have wielded it recklessly. You have spread ideas that threaten the very order of our republic." Lorenzo stood taller, his gaze unwavering as it locked with the Inquisitor's. "You claim to protect order, but it is an order built on ignorance, on the suppression of knowledge. You would burn the truth to preserve your power, but truth cannot be extinguished. It will find its way into the world, with or without your approval." There was a murmur in the crowd, some of the onlookers exchanging looks of uncertainty. It was as if Lorenzo's words had shaken something deep within them. Could they, too, see what he saw, the fragile line between knowledge and power, the way those in power sought to control what the world could know? But before anyone could speak, the Inquisitor slammed the manuscript onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. "You stand accused of heresy and sedition, Master Valiani," the Inquisitor continued, his voice thick with disdain. "By your own admission, you have spread forbidden knowledge, knowledge that undermines the authority of the Church and the stability of the state. You have conspired to incite rebellion. And for this, you will be punished." Lorenzo's stomach twisted with dread, but he refused to flinch. He had seen this before, seen how those in power wielded fear like a blade, cutting down anyone who dared to question the status quo. But he would not be silenced. Not now. Not ever. "You speak of rebellion," he said, his voice rising, "but it is not rebellion to seek the truth. It is not sedition to question the world around us. It is the very nature of man to seek knowledge, to explore, to learn. Without that, we are nothing but puppets, dancing to the whims of those who would keep us in the dark." The Inquisitor's face flushed with anger. "Enough," he bellowed, his fist slamming onto the table. "Your words are poison, and you will be punished for them." The court fell silent once again, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The weight of the room bore down on Lorenzo, the knowledge that his fate rested in the hands of these men. But even in that moment, he felt something stir within him, the sense of resolve, of conviction that could not be shaken. The verdict came swiftly. The Inquisitor, unable to conceal his anger any longer, raised his voice to announce the sentence. "Lorenzo Valiani, for your crimes against the Church and the State, your works shall be burned. All your manuscripts, your illuminations, your knowledge, will be destroyed. And as for you, your life shall be spared only by the intervention of those who secretly favor your cause. You shall be exiled from Venice, never to return." The gavel fell with a resounding thud, sealing his fate. But even as the room erupted in murmurs of approval from some and outrage from others, Lorenzo felt a strange calm settle over him. He had expected nothing less. His actions had been reckless, yes, but they had been necessary. And though his works would be destroyed, though his name would be smeared and forgotten, he knew in his heart that he had done what was right. The book, the knowledge contained within its pages, had already begun to spread. Whispers of its existence had reached the right people, and copies had been made. The printing press, that great invention that had so threatened his craft, had now become his ally. The words of the manuscript would not be confined to the flames. They would endure. As Lorenzo was escorted from the courtroom, his body numb with the weight of his exile, he couldn't help but smile, a small, quiet smile that was full of defiance and hope. He had done enough. The truth could no longer be contained. And though he would never return to Venice, his legacy would live on. The book would spread, its wisdom would seep into the minds of those who sought it, and it would ignite a spark that could not be extinguished. Lorenzo had given everything for that spark, and he would be content knowing that the light of truth would continue to shine long after he was gone. In the end, it was not the trial that defined him, it was the truth. And the truth, once seen, could never be unlearned. Chapter 7: A Light in the Darkness. Banished from Venice, Lorenzo Valiani walked the dusty roads of Europe, a man without a home, but not without purpose. The golden city he had once called home, where his art had flourished under the patronage of noblemen and scholars, had turned its back on him. It had cast him into exile, and yet, in his heart, he knew that his exile was not the end. It was simply a new beginning. The first days of his banishment had been the hardest. Lorenzo had no destination, no place to call his own. He traveled from city to city, moving silently through the night, ever wary of being recognized. His reputation had spread, but not in the way he had hoped. He was no longer the esteemed illuminator of Venice. He was a heretic, a criminal, a man whose name was associated with danger and rebellion. But as the weeks passed, something began to change. Lorenzo found that there were places where knowledge was still valued, where scholars still sought the truth, even at great personal risk. In these hidden corners of Europe, he found refuge. In the flickering candlelight of dimly lit libraries, he found kindred spirits, men and women who believed that knowledge should be preserved, no matter the cost. It was in these quiet, forgotten places that Lorenzo continued his work. He did not have the luxuries of his old studio in Venice, no fine inks, no golden leaf, but he had his hands, and he had his skill. He taught the art of illumination to those who were eager to learn, showing them how to bring life to the written word with nothing more than pigments, parchment, and a steady hand. He shared his knowledge of ancient texts, transcribing and illuminating manuscripts that had been lost to time. In the shadows of Europe, Lorenzo became a teacher, a guardian of knowledge, a light in the darkness. In time, he moved to a small town in the southern part of France, a place known for its libraries and its scholars. It was there, in the quiet hours before dawn, that Lorenzo received the first whisper of the manuscript's legacy. Master Valiani, a young scholar, had said, his voice trembling with excitement, "There are rumors. The manuscript you carried, there are copies of it. Hidden, of course. But they are spreading. Scholars are whispering about it in secret gatherings. The ideas within it, they are being discussed." Lorenzo had been taken aback, unsure if the young man was speaking of the same manuscript that had nearly cost him his life. But the scholar's eyes gleamed with an unmistakable fervor. "It is true. People are reading it, debating it. Some are even printing it in secret. The ideas about science, philosophy, and the nature of truth are spreading. Lorenzo's heart swelled with a strange, quiet joy. The manuscript that had once been the cause of his downfall was now a beacon for others, a spark in the darkness. He had feared that the knowledge it contained would be buried forever, but instead, it was alive. It had taken root in places he could not have imagined, in minds that could not be silenced. As the years passed, the rumors continued. Lorenzo would hear tales of the manuscript turning up in hidden libraries in Spain, in scholarly circles in the Netherlands, in the secret meetings of intellectuals in Prague. The printing press, once his enemy, had become his greatest ally. What had once been a tool for mass production of books, something that had threatened the delicate artistry of illumination, was now spreading the very knowledge that had once been suppressed. The ideas within the manuscript were being printed, copied, and shared. And with each new copy that found its way into the hands of scholars and thinkers, the light of truth grew brighter. Lorenzo smiled as he sat in the small, dimly lit room of his modest home, the faint glow of the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. His hands, once calloused and worn from the meticulous work of illuminating manuscripts, had grown old. But his mind remained sharp, his passion undiminished. He had never stopped teaching, never stopped illuminating. And now, he knew that his work had transcended the boundaries of time and space. The manuscript was no longer a single, fragile book hidden in the dark corners of Venice. It had become something greater, something eternal. The wisdom it contained was being shared across Europe, whispered in the halls of universities, debated in the quiet corners of libraries. It had sparked a revolution of thought, a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to control knowledge. And though the fires of persecution still burned in some parts of the world, the manuscript had found a way to survive. It had found a way to live on. One evening, as Lorenzo sat at his desk, a letter arrived from a distant city. It was from an old friend, a scholar who had once helped him transcribe the manuscript. The letter spoke of a new edition of the manuscript that had been printed in secret and distributed among a group of scholars in Florence. The words were now being debated publicly, discussed in broad daylight. The ideas that had once been confined to the shadows were now being brought into the light. Lorenzo could scarcely believe it. The manuscript was no longer just a symbol of his exile, it had become a force of change. It had become a part of something larger, a movement that transcended borders, that reached into the hearts and minds of people who dared to seek the truth. The years had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments when he had wondered if his work had been in vain, if the sacrifices had been worth it. But now, as he sat in his humble home, he knew that it had all been worth it. The manuscript had done what it was meant to do. It had lit a fire in the hearts of those who had read it, and that fire could not be extinguished. Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed, a sense of peace settling over him. He had once feared that his craft was fading, that the art of illumination would be lost to time. But in the end, he had given light to something far greater than himself, a light that would never fade. His work, his legacy, had not been confined to the past. It had become a part of the future. And as long as there were people who sought knowledge, the Illuminator's work would never truly end. It would live on in the minds of those who had read the manuscript, in the hearts of those who had dared to question, and in the hands of those who would continue to illuminate the truth for generations to come. Lorenzo smiled softly to himself, knowing that, in the end, the light he had given to the world would burn brighter than any flame. And it would burn forever.